Kapitän-Leutnant Erich Kellerman was a U-boat ace, a warrior whose sole mission was to paralyze America by fear and famine. But after his capture, he was taken on a chilling tour of the San Diego Navy Yard, where he saw one devastating sight that didn't just break his will, but forced his face to go white, as he realized his entire war was mathematically irrelevant. It was March 1943, and the North Atlantic had finally exhausted its tolerance for Kellerman's defiance. An American destroyer, the USS McClanahan, had found them in the fog. The barrage of depth charges was relentless, shattering gauges and cracking the pressure hull until the commander realized continuing the battle would only result in the drowning of his 83 crewmen. The moment he gave the order to blow the ballast tanks and surface, the ultimate act of military surrender, was the moment the war ended for him. When the hatch finally cranked open, the frigid air and the blinding sunlight felt like a physical assault. Kellerman stood on the tower, his uniform soaked, the bitter salt spray mixing with the tears he refused to shed. He saw the American sailors, not filled with the hatred the Reich's propaganda had promised, but with grim, tired professionalism. Kellerman was taken aboard the destroyer, separated from his men, and stripped of his rank insignia, a moment of professional violation. His future, according to the official pamphlets, was clear. He would be interrogated, starved, or made to toil until the war's end. They had been told Americans were savages, lacking honor, and that capture meant humiliation. This propaganda was the lifeblood of the U-boat force. Kellerman, a devoted officer, had swallowed it whole. He believed the American nation was too soft, too corrupt, and too chaotic to fight a protracted total war against the disciplined will of the Third Reich. He believed his U-boats were winning, successfully strangling the supply lines. The journey to the East Coast was brutal. When he finally stepped onto a brightly lit American dock, the sight was disorienting. He was immediately transferred, not to a dank prison, but to a clean holding facility where he was given fresh clothes and food. This small detail, this tiny crack in the edifice of his beliefs, was profoundly unnerving. The Americans were treating him not as a hated monster, but as a tedious, logistical problem. He expected chains and contempt. Instead, he was given documentation and a blanket. Kellerman was soon marched onto a waiting, massive American train. He realized his journey into the heart of the enemy's strength was just beginning. The terrifying continent unfolding outside his window hinted that the truth was much larger than the depth he commanded. The constant drumming of the wheels on the tracks was a new form of torture, a rhythmic reminder of the immense distance separating Kellerman from his homeland. As the train carried him further west, his initial confusion hardened back into native contempt. His mind refused to acknowledge the truth of what unfolded before his eyes. The Reich's propaganda had painted America as a brittle democracy, where production was slow and the masses were sustained by thin soup. This journey offered Kellerman a view of a scale he had never conceived. He saw vast, uninterrupted stretches of agricultural land far beyond what German farms could produce. There were no signs of starvation or rationing. The fields were teeming with potential, casually attended by enormous, roaring tractors. Kellerman stared, convincing himself it was all a fragile facade, an unsustainable mirage built on debt and luck. The train itself offered a terrifying lesson in logistics. Unlike the slow, overloaded railways of wartime Germany, the American train moved with frightening speed and efficiency. Kellerman watched as they passed switching yards the size of small cities. The train was loaded with raw materials, flatbeds stacked high with lumber, coal, and steel girders that appeared boundless. This sheer, unthinking abundance struck him with a chill. His entire mission was to sever the supply lines, yet here, the lines seemed to spontaneously generate. He tried to dismiss it all as an illusion. Where was the poverty? Where was the material strain that defined total war? Instead, he saw towns where every house looked new, where massive vehicles moved on wide, unscarred asphalt roads. He clung to his belief that this scale was a weakness, a chaotic overreach that German efficiency would eventually capitalize on. One afternoon, the train stopped. Kellerman saw a freight train carrying 63 cars of the exact same type of tank chassis, all perfectly identical. The sheer uniformity was what unnerved him most. It spoke not of superior German engineering, but of a horrifying, unstoppable ability to deliver war at scale. Kellerman had believed he was waging war against an enemy struggling to build 2 ships. He was beginning to glimpse a nation that treated shipbuilding as a mere industrial byproduct. He was finally transported off the train at a barren, dusty depot. The air was hot and dry. As he was transferred to a waiting military vehicle, he felt the American war machine closing around him. He had expected to see an enemy weakened. Instead, he had seen something else entirely. A giant that had barely begun to flex its true terrifying muscle. You are witnessing a story about a man whose entire reality was destroyed by one astonishing sight. The journey is just beginning. Subscribe now so you don't miss the moment the U-boat captain's face turns pale. The vehicle finally stopped at a place that should have been a sight of dread. A prisoner of war camp deep in the arid landscape of Arizona. Yet, the scene that greeted him was neither the cage of steel and fire promised by German radio, nor the slave labor operation. It was a place of unnerving order. The camp was clean, almost clinically neat. The barbed wire was present, but the guards were few, leaning casually on their rifles without the slightest hint of hostility. The American system, it seemed, was designed not to crush morale, but to manage it through relentless, unexciting decency. This was the first shock. The dignity afforded to him. They were given clean bedding, adequate, well-balanced meals, set at 3,000 calories. Kellerman watched his men eat beef stew and fresh bread, their initial fear giving way to dumbfounded relief. He himself could barely stomach the food, convinced this was the softening up phase before the inevitable mental pressure began. His actual interrogation, however, was equally confusing. He was ushered into an office to meet Lieutenant Commander Hayes, a man whose easy confidence instantly grated on the German captain. Hayes was not a theatrical inquisitor. He offered a cigarette, spoke in measured German, and treated Kellerman not as a criminal, but as a colleague on the losing side of a very clear equation. "Captain," Hayes began, "you are an officer. We will follow the Geneva Conventions exactly. We are not interested in torturing you. We are interested in winning the war, and you are now just a piece of evidence." The lack of hatred was the first profound psychological strike. Hayes then made his extraordinary proposal, a short, supervised trip away from the camp. "The Reich tells its soldiers that America is weak, disorganized, and starving," Hayes said. "I will show you something that your maps and your intelligence reports could never communicate. The simple reality of our capacity." Kellerman's first instinct was refusal, but the audacity of the offer and the calm, unwavering certainty in Hayes's eyes piqued his curiosity. He suspected a trick. Hayes wasn't appealing to fear. He was appealing to Kellerman's professional soldier's belief in absolute facts. Driven by contempt and a thirst for military knowledge, Kellerman gave a stiff nod. "I will go," he agreed, "but I will not speak." Hayes merely smiled, a genuine, warm expression that was more unsettling than a threat of violence. Hayes's confidence was so profound, he didn't even need to hate his enemy. "We don't need your words, Captain," Hayes replied. "We only need your eyes." The next morning, Kellerman was placed unshackled into the back of a black Navy sedan. He felt a profound disorientation, leaving the confinement of the camp for the freedom of the open road, guarded only by the calm presence of Hayes. He had intended to face his enemy with rigid contempt. Now he was facing an enigma that had casually offered him a 3,000-calorie meal and a guided tour of its hidden power. The Navy sedan moved swiftly, crossing the vast American West. Captain Lieutenant Kellerman, confined but unrestrained, watched the flow of the enemy's logistical veins. Hayes, sensing the captain's attention, spoke without turning his head. "Your mission, Captain, was to starve us. We call that a war of attrition." Hayes's tone was neutral. As they drove, the highway, already wider and better maintained than any Autobahn Kellerman had commanded, became a visual lesson in abundance. The primary traffic was not military convoys, but a constant stream of civilian tanker trucks and cargo carriers. Hayes pointed to a cluster of semi-trailers loaded with fresh citrus fruit. "That," he said, "is a non-essential shipment. It moves freely. No rationing, no priority. If your efforts were truly slowing us down, you would see soldiers on this road, not oranges." Kellerman scoffed internally, mentally labeling the site decadent proof of fragile overreach. The site was a quiet, relentless assault on Kellerman's reality. His career had been predicated on creating shortages, but here there were none. They passed endless pipelines snaking across the hills, dedicated conduits carrying fuel from the interior to the coast. He had targeted oil tankers with surgical precision, yet here was evidence that the oil they sank was but a trickle compared to a subterranean river. The true shock was the sheer lack of urgency. The American war effort seemed to bleed seamlessly into the civilian world. Hayes stopped the car near a plant dedicated to making simple engine components. Kellerman realized the facility was immense, yet its gates were unguarded. It was operating 24 hours a day, workers moving with a steady, quiet discipline. The plant was not producing a single weapon. It was producing standardized parts that could be used in trucks, planes, or ships interchangeably. The captain decided he was witnessing a grand chaotic waste, clinging to his belief that such sprawling production must be inefficient. Kellerman had thought of America as a soft target. Instead, he saw a system so vast and interconnected that the removal of a single tanker was absorbed without a flinch, immediately replaced by the flow from the continent itself. The U-boat war was not a matter of strangulation. It was, as Hayes had implied, merely chipping paint off the granite foundation of a continental industrial power. His pride began to feel flimsy. Hayes was showing him a reality measured by tons of production capacity, an almost infinite number. The captain's contempt now curdled into a cold, professional dread. The sun began to set as they approached the coast. The journey had been a psychological primer, forcing him to accept that the enemy was not defined by its soldiers or its warships, but by the overwhelming, quiet certainty of its machines. He knew the next stop would be San Diego, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that what he was about to see would confirm the terrifying truth that the war was already mathematically over. The final stretch of highway brought the sedan up a gradual incline. As it crested the hill, Captain Lieutenant Kellerman inhaled sharply. The site below was not a military harbor, bristling with defenses, but something far more colossal and terrifying, a kingdom of industry. Sprawling below them was the San Diego Navy Yard, not as a collection of piers, but as a vast, coherent ecosystem dedicated entirely to manufacturing war. It was a terrifying landscape of order. Miles of newly laid rail spurs, giant yellow gantry cranes, and acres of prefabricated hulls lay waiting. The sheer scale was what paralyzed Kellerman. He had expected a dock. This was an industrial continent grafted onto the sea. Hayes slowed the car. "Look carefully, Captain," Hayes advised. "We didn't bring you here to show you our defenses. Notice that the gates are not heavily guarded. This is not a secret place. It is simply a fact." To a mind trained in scarcity and secrecy, this open display of power was bewildering. Here, the military installation flowed directly into the civilian life of the city, utterly confident in its security, which was rooted not in defenses but in its overwhelming size. The yard was so large that it seemed to render Kellerman's entire U-boat campaign irrelevant. The ground was immaculate. Raw materials were staged with terrifying efficiency, waiting to be consumed by the furnaces of the yard. The focus was not on fighting the war, but on building the war, treating it as a sustained, high-volume industrial project. Kellerman had internalized the belief in German worker efficiency. But the volume of material moving through this yard suggested an efficiency born of system, of standardized design, endless resources, and a terrifying ability to streamline chaos into production. The Navy Yard was not a shipyard. It was a production line for oceanic domination. As Hayes finally drove through the wide, simple gates, Kellerman's stomach tightened. He was about to witness up close the mechanism that guaranteed his nation's defeat. The ideological certainty that had sustained him for years was dissolving, replaced by a cold, objective assessment of material power. Hayes parked the car near administrative buildings, the noise of metal on metal already deafening. "We have arrived, Captain," Hayes said, his voice quiet. "Now you will see what you have been fighting." The real tour was finally about to begin. The sound was overwhelming. A dissonant orchestra of grinding steel, the insistent thrum of heavy machinery, and the high, whining call of the gantry cranes above. This was the true soundtrack of America's war, and it was here, standing on a viewing platform, that Kapitan Leutnant Kellerman finally looked into the abyss of his own defeat. He had expected to see a struggle. What he saw instead was a stunning, terrifying example of parallel production. Below him were not one or two dry docks, but long, continuous slips where 4 separate destroyer hulls were being assembled simultaneously. They were in varying stages of completion, moving along a terrifying industrial timeline. One hull was a skeletal framework, another was half-plated, and the third was a nearly complete gray ghost. The speed was unbelievable. In Germany, a U-boat took many months of specialized labor to complete. A destroyer was a colossal undertaking. Yet here, the components seemed to fly through the air, lowered by the huge cranes and welded into place by workers moving with steady, efficient rhythm. The Americans were treating the construction of a warship not as a bespoke craft, but as an assembly line product. Hayes observed Kellerman's stunned silence. "You sank 300,000 tons last month, Captain," he said. "We launch more than that in replacement capacity every 90 days. We are not interested in the rate of sinking. We are interested in the rate of construction." It was a cold, objective truth that struck Kellerman with physical force. His entire war strategy was built on the concept of attrition. But attrition was useless when faced with a manufacturing operation that treated the loss of a vessel as a routine, predictable expense. The sight of the 4 parallel hulls was the final, devastating piece of evidence, and in that instant, the blood visibly drained from Kellerman's face. This was the moment his absolute belief in the superiority of the Reich's war effort was fundamentally broken. He stared down at the workers, realizing that every successful torpedo he had fired had been nullified by a few hours of relentless, mechanized labor in this single port. He had failed to grasp the terrifying scale of the war being waged on land. He had discovered a giant whose fingers were assembling warships with casual indifference. Kellerman swallowed, his throat dry. The noise now felt like the relentless, deafening rhythm of his nation's fate. He realized that the war was not going to be lost because of poor soldiers. It was going to be lost because of mathematical certainty. This is the moment Kellerman's face went pale. Imagine what that one sight did to the morale of the U-boat fleet. What do you believe was the most decisive factor in the Axis defeat? Industrial scale or superior strategy? Let us know in the comments below. As they moved away from the main construction slips, the roar of the steel became less dominating, allowing Kellerman's attention to shift to the people operating the machines. Kellerman was conditioned to see war workers as extensions of the state. The civilian army, he now observed, contradicted every image planted in his mind by propaganda. His eyes focused on a woman in simple overalls, calmly operating a heavy pneumatic rivet gun. The tool was loud and powerful, yet she wielded it with unhurried, almost casual expertise. She was not alone. He saw older men, men with physical challenges, and a significant number of women working side by side. They were moving steel, welding bulkheads, and running machinery with undeniable competence. Kellerman noted the casual laughter, the brief, easy exchanges, and the absence of any shouting. Supervisors. Hayes leaned in. That woman with the rivet gun, Captain, was a secretary until a year ago. She is not conscripted. She is here because she wants to be. Her motivation is her home, her family, and the knowledge that she is helping to keep this work flowing. This was the profound, subtle difference Kellerman struggled to grasp. In his system, labor was duty, enforced by threat. Here, the labor was voluntary, yet the efficiency was higher than any he had witnessed. The workers were fueled by ownership, not obedience. The American confidence was so immense it didn't need to police its workers with soldiers. It simply empowered them with tools and trust, knowing they would deliver. Kellerman had believed the American people were spoiled and lazy. Now he saw that their wartime effort was built on a foundation of civilian competence that stretched effortlessly back into the nation's deepest resources. This terrifying depth of human resource meant the enemy's industrial output was virtually inexhaustible. He realized his torpedoes were not sinking ships. They were merely creating more job openings. Hayes stopped, pointing to a small sign. "The more we build, the sooner they return." It was a simple, non-ideological message. The captain's contempt was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, objective awe. He realized he had been fighting an entire, fully engaged society that treated the war not as a grand crusade, but as the world's largest production contract. They turned a corner, and the workers faded behind a long building. Kellerman knew that the demonstration was not over. Hayes was determined to show him the final, undeniable proof of a defeat that was already written in steel. The path led Capitan Lieutenant Kellerman and Lieutenant Commander Hayes into the vast inventory warehouse. It was a library of identical parts, holding perhaps the most abstract, yet most devastating, lesson of the day. Inside, the light reflected off endless rows of shelving, housing simple, identical components. Standardized steel valves, engine mounts, piping sections, all perfectly uniform. It was a library of identical parts, each one ready to be pulled and installed on any of the 4 destroyer hulls. Hayes paused. "You Germans are masters of precision, Captain. Each of your U-boats is a bespoke instrument. But if one component fails, you wait for a unique replacement. We do not." Kellerman, who prided himself on German engineering, felt a deep intellectual offense at this mass-produced uniformity. Yet, the military logic was terrifyingly sound. Hayes explained that American ships were built not with superior quality, but with superior repairability. If a torpedo struck a ship requiring a new valve, that valve could be pulled instantly from this inventory, regardless of where the ship was built. The difference in time was the difference between a ship being out of commission for 6 months or 6 weeks. The warehouse was a monument to the power of standardization. It meant that every American ship was part of a terrifying, self-healing naval ecosystem. Kellerman realized that his U-boat war was simply targeting floating units that were instantly renewable. The American system treated its ships not as irreplaceable treasures, but as fungible units in a gigantic, ever-moving ledger. The American strategy was not about creating a small number of perfect machines. It was about creating an overwhelming quantity of adequate machines that could be rapidly built, repaired, and replaced. The sheer lack of preciousness toward the material was what truly humbled the captain. He saw this not as decadence, but as a chilling, ultimate confidence in their own industrial capacity. They could afford to be less perfect because they could afford to be limitless. This insight shattered one of Kellerman's final ideological strongholds. The American way was a more effective form of industrial warfare. It established an unbeatable equation for the Allies. As they exited the cold warehouse, the air suddenly felt heavier. Kellerman had seen the endless trains, the parallel hulls, the civilian workers, and now the library of interchangeable parts. He had observed the entire devastating equation of American power, but Hayes had one final lesson, a quiet, crushing truth that would leave the U-boat captain with absolutely nowhere left to hide. The sun was beginning its slow descent as Hayes drove Kellerman to their final, quiet destination, a seemingly unremarkable coastal area a few miles south of the shipyard. There were no battleships, no construction, only a series of low, artificially contoured hills covered in camouflage netting. They stepped out of the car. Hayes pointed to the low hills. "Captain, the U-boat war was fundamentally about one thing: fuel. Your command was designed to cause the destruction of our supply at sea." He paused, allowing the wind to carry his words. "What you are looking at is the storage. This facility, built in secret, holds more high-octane aviation and naval fuel than your entire U-boat group could ever hope to sink. It is one of 17 such sites on the west coast alone." The tanks, hidden beneath the carefully shaped earth, were gargantuan, a silent, static testament to the inexhaustible flow of oil Kellerman had seen traveling across the country. This was the final, crushing blow. Kellerman's entire military career had been a desperate attempt to create scarcity, but here he was facing the ultimate reality: an industrial power so vast that it could afford to store its primary resource in quantities that rendered the entire Battle of the Atlantic an exercise in futility. It was the difference between fighting a war of attrition and fighting a war of absolute resource certainty. In Germany, every barrel of oil was accounted for and guarded. Here, Hayes was showing him the entrance to an endless supply, a subterranean sea of fuel that laughed at the idea of a blockade. Hayes simply stated the final cold truth. You sink what we ship. We ship what we pump. The difference, Captain, is the war. You were fighting a fire. We were sitting on an aquifer. Kellerman finally broke his silence. He spoke softly. We were taught, he whispered, that the Americans were soft, that they would never endure the privation required for total war. He finally turned to Hayes. We did not understand that for America there is no privation. There is only more. He had seen the parallel ships, the willing workers, and the interchangeable parts. Now he saw the final fundamental source of that power, the casual, unquestioning access to seemingly infinite natural resources, engineered into a system that was beyond destroying. In that moment, Kapitänleutnant Erich Kellerman realized that the war was not lost on the battlefields of Europe. It was lost here, in the quiet, overwhelming industrial heart of America, years before his U-boat was captured. The U-boat captain's tour is complete, and his reality is shattered. Share this story to reveal how American industrial might, not just military strategy, became the quiet ambassador of Allied victory. The ride back to the Arizona camp was conducted in absolute silence, a silence heavier than the vacuum that had followed the depth charges. Kellerman was no longer the defiant U-boat captain. He was an empty vessel, now filled with the chilling certainty of mathematical defeat. His pride was utterly dissolved. When the sedan pulled back into the prisoner compound, his fellow officers swarmed him. They had whispered rumors of his absence. Erich, what did they do to you? One asked. Did they threaten you? Were you treated cruelly? Kellerman looked at his comrade, who still clutched the false comfort of Reich propaganda, and found he could not lie. He did not tell them of torture. He told them of the parallel hulls, the endless lines of standardized parts, and the enormous hidden ocean of fuel. We are not fighting an army, he said, his voice quiet but firm. We are fighting an entire continent. We are defeated, not by bravery, but by the overwhelming industrial might of a foe we never saw coming. His words, the testimony of a highly decorated officer, sent a tremor of unsettling reality through the camp. His new role was not that of a prisoner, but a quiet, reluctant ambassador of American industrial might. The war ended some months later. He was eventually repatriated, sailing back to a Germany that was broken, starved, and reduced to rubble. His parents' home was leveled. His former unit was scattered. Yet, Kellerman returned with something cold, hard, and useful: knowledge. He had learned that true power was not in the quality of a single machine, but in the efficiency of the system that could replace that machine in weeks. This lesson became the unlikely foundation of his new life. He settled in Hamburg and used his engineering knowledge, translating the Americans' principles of standardization, massive scale, and interchangeable parts into the civilian sector. Kellerman worked on municipal projects, pushing for standardized bricks, pipes, and construction techniques that could rebuild the city faster and cheaper. Years later, Kellerman was invited to speak at a conference on post-war industrial cooperation. He stood before a crowd and told the story of his tour. He spoke of his pale face as he looked upon the 4 parallel hulls and the realization that his life's mission had been mathematically irrelevant. We lost the war because we were arrogant, he concluded simply. We valued bespoke perfection. The Americans valued efficient, reliable volume. They showed me their power not through threats, but through truth. And that truth, I used to rebuild my home. He had come to America filled with a righteous contempt. He had left years later transformed into a quiet advocate for the principles of efficiency, pragmatism, and scale, the very weapons that caused the destruction of his nation. His defeat in the Atlantic was a moment of personal failure. His transformation in San Diego was a quiet, profound victory for the future of 2 nations. The war might have been lost, but a crucial element of the peace was won in the silent industrial yards of the American coast. If Kellerman's story of industrial surrender changed your perspective on the war, let us know by hitting that like button. And to ensure you never miss another incredible story of history's turning points, be sure to subscribe before you go.